There are two conditions that needed to be satisfied when Maori chiefs sold their land. 1. Maori had to be disposed to sell their land, and 2. The British were not to buy land that Maori needed for their comfort, safety, or for the production of food for themselves. Wrongful confiscations did not meet the criteria of Maori being willing to sell their lands. For example, Parliament's Waikato Rapatu Claims Settlement Act 1995 contained an apology by the Crown to Waikato in the deed of settlement for sending its forces across the Mangatawiri River in July 1863, unfairly labelling Waikato as rebels, and subsequently confiscating their land. In the Act, the Crown acknowledged that the confiscations of land and resources under the New Zealand Settlements Act 1863 of the New Zealand Parliament were wrongful, caused Waikato to the present time to suffer feelings in relation to their lost lands akin to those of orphans, and have had a crippling impact on the welfare, economy, and development of Waikato. Another example of land confiscation is land taken from Wakatohia, a prominent Maori iwi in the Eastern Bay of Plenty. In the Wakatohia Claims Settlement Act 2024, the Crown acknowledged that 7,638 acres of Wakatohia land at Pakihi became Crown land under its surplus land policy. The Crown acknowledged that it breached the Treaty of Waitangi by confirming the pre-treaty transaction without ensuring the Pakihi block had been adequately surveyed, and by later applying its surplus lands policy to the block, without having assessed whether Wakatohia would retain adequate lands for their needs after the Pakihi land was taken. For an example of the British buying land that Maori needed for the production of food for themselves, let's look at the Crown's apology contained in the Ngāi Tahu Claims Settlement Act 1998. The Crown acknowledged that it acted unconscionably and in repeated breach of the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi in its dealings with Ngāi Tahu in the purchases of Ngāi Tahu land. The Crown further acknowledged that in relation to the deeds of purchase it failed in most material respects to honour its obligations to Ngāi Tahu as its treaty partner, while it also failed to set aside adequate lands for Ngāi Tahu's use, and to provide adequate economic and social resources for Ngāi Tahu. The Crown acknowledged that, in breach of Article 2 of the treaty, it failed to preserve and protect Ngāi Tahu's use and ownership of such of their land and valued possessions as they wished to retain. Over 90% of land in New Zealand was legitimately sold by the Maori. Over the mid-1800s to early 1900s. Compensation to iwi for land lost has never been about compensation for this land that was legitimately sold. It is for land that was taken in breach of the treaty, or not reserved for iwi, also in breach of the treaty. Between 1844 and 1864, Ngāi Tahu entered into agreements with the Crown and the New Zealand Company to sell vast areas of land, amounting to approximately 80% of the South Island or 34.5 million acres. A key term of these contracts, as understood by Ngāi Tahu, was that around 1/10, 10%, of the land purchased would be reserved for the iwi's use, ensuring they retained an economic base and access to resources. The Crown also promised to build schools and hospitals and protect food gathering sites. The Crown did not fulfill these obligations. Instead of receiving 10% of the land, Ngāi Tahu received only about 37,000 acres for the tribe's use in total across the major purchases, a tiny fraction of the land sold. One source indicates that only 0.1% of the land was actually returned as reserves. The Crown also failed to provide promised infrastructure like schools and hospitals, or protect traditional food sources. The claim was finally settled through the Ngāi Tahu Claims Settlement Act 1998. The settlement included a financial component of $170 million, an apology from the Crown, and cultural redress, but it did not involve the return of 10% of the original land.